It's 12:01, so I think we're going to get started with today's panel from the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Today's panel is on U.S. strategy in Asia, and we have a very special guest with us today. So excited to have Abe Denmark here to talk about his new book on U.S. strategy in Asia called Empowering Allies, a strategy for a new era in the Indo-Pacific. Abe has been a very active participant in many of the NCAFP's Forum on Asia-Pacific Security's Track 2 discussions and programs, and we are very grateful to him for his active participation over the years. He is also a recipient of our 21st Century American Leaders Award, for distinguished contributions to American foreign policy. I should say I'm Susan Thornton. I'm the director of the Forum on Asia Pacific here at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And we are so pleased to be able to bring this panel to you today for what is a really, I think, going to be insightful discussion on a very hot topic, which is sort of in the news every day today. What should the U.S. be doing in the Asia Pacific, and what should we be looking forward to in 2021 for U.S. policy in this region? Abe Denmark, of course, is the director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, and he's a senior fellow at the center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. But Abe and I have a long history together in the U.S. government. He served previously as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia at the end of the Obama administration. He was also the China Director in the Office of the Secretary of Defense earlier in the Obama administration. And he, in between and prior, held positions at the National Bureau of Asian Research, the Center for New American Security, and he held several positions prior to that in the U.S. intelligence community. So he has a terrific background and experience for talking to all of us today about his book and about his vision for U.S. policy in East Asia. I'm also pleased to be able to introduce the moderator for our program, my deputy at the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security, a stellar East Asian scholar and very hard worker on all of our programs, Rory Daniels. She is going to moderate our program today and explain to everybody how they can participate and ask questions. So we're very much looking forward to the conversation, and I know it's going to be a very rich and exciting time for us the next 90 minutes. Go ahead, Rory, take it from here.
Okay, thanks so much, Susan. Thanks for that kind introduction and for getting us started here today. We are going to talk for about 30 minutes or so about the content of the book and then open up for audience questions. There's no need to wait. If you have a question, please go ahead and submit it. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions, and I will be monitoring that throughout this session, and hopefully we'll get to all of your great questions, and we'll have a discussion based on what you want to talk about. Before I start asking Abe about some of the content of his book, I just want to say that I've been reading it over the last week. It is an incredibly well-written, well-argued account of what we can do, what the U.S. can do in terms of strategy in the Indo-Pacific and strategy to meet the challenges of the era that we're in. And one of the reasons I am so excited to lead this discussion today is that it builds on themes that we discuss all the time in our work at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. If you're new to our organization, we were founded by Hans Morgenthau in the 1970s, the so-called godfather of political realism. And we spend a lot of our time talking about balance of power issues that this book addresses very saliently and very thoroughly. So I'd like to start with that in mind by taking a very broad overview of the international system. So Abe, We are living, it seems, in an era of major power competition, and our international system is often described as the arena for this major power competition. I'd like to start by asking you, as two of the major powers, the US and China, are kind of encountering greater friction in pursuing their national interests, what are the US and China competing over?
Well, thanks, Rory, and thank you, Susan, for such kind words and for introducing me. And thank you to the National Committee. I've been engaging with you for a long time, and every time it's just a very fruitful discussion. I think the National Committee on American Foreign Policy just is a critical voice in the United States, in New York, on American foreign policy, on the current state of the world. And I'm just thrilled to be able to join you. And thanks again for having me. It's great to see both of you. In terms of what we're competing with China over, I think it's a terrific question. I think it's still a question that's being debated. The Trump administration has been very clear that they see the US-China relationship as fundamentally competitive. And there's a broad consensus across most sectors in Washington on that point, that we are competing with China. Yet there's still not a lot of clarity about what we're ultimately competing over, including within the Trump administration. So my argument, and the argument that I make in my book, I make an important distinction between two related concepts, power and order. Power being sort of the measurable assets of a country, their wealth, their military might, the degree of influence that they have, whereas order is more of the rules of the road in the international system, the operating system in which countries live. And that order dictates how countries interact with one another, how they manage their contradictory interests. And what my argument is that ultimately, this is what we're competing over with China, over power and order. Power in terms of which economy is more dynamic and larger, which military has specific military advantages over the other in various contingencies, which country has more influence over the other in various parts of the world, but also over order, what we want the international system to look like, what we want the role of international laws, norms, and institutions to be. And so ultimately, to me, when you look at what we're competing over, it boils down to those two core concepts. And I try to make a distinction between the two and talk about how they interrelate. But ultimately, I think that's what we're competing with China over the long term.
Yes, thank you. I think that really sets up a framework for both the book and for this discussion. And I want to start by diving a little further into the order question, because this seems to be an area, first of all, that China's growing power can create a lot of influence on, and also something that the US seems quite anxious about, shifts in the international order. So talk us through some of the differences between the US approach to international order and China's approach. What ultimately does China want from the international system?
Sure. The US approach, the way I describe it as a post-war liberal order, in which international institutions, laws, and norms are established, and they regulate how states interact with one another and how they resolve contradictory issues. Not perfectly. We don't always follow those rules and norms ourselves, but broadly speaking, it's been a very successful system in that the world has grown more peaceful and more prosperous since then. And especially in Asia, that the liberal order enabled the rise of countries across the region, Japan and Korea first, then countries in Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and then more recently China and India. And they were able to do that because the region was relatively stable and conducive to trade and investment. The Chinese view of order is very different in that they see the international order, even though it's been very much in their interest and they've risen because of that external context. They also see the region as primarily built by the West, by the United States, and at a time when China was relatively weak, or when Beijing itself had little say in the construction of that interest. And so there's a built-in sense of skepticism about aspects of the international order, but the argument that the book makes is that China is not a revolutionary power. China is not trying to tear down the system. We know what a revolutionary China looks like, and we saw that under Mao, and that's not what China is trying to do. China is still very much engaged in international institutions, and its approach to various international laws and norms is much more complex than to say that they are either a status quo power or a revolutionary power. The way I describe it is that they see themselves, and their approach to the international order is what I call exceptionalist, in that it's a different form of exceptionalism than American exceptionalism, in that American exceptionalism is based more on our sense of our purpose in the world and the unique role that the United States plays because of our ideals and our principles. Whereas for China, it's much more rooted in their history and their sense as a civilization. And so when I describe an exceptionalist foreign policy, it's more a sense that there's a general sense that laws and norms are there. They're not trying to tear down these institutions wholesale, but rather carve out exceptions for themselves when they find that the interests and preferences of the Chinese Communist Party conflict with the established order. And the best example I can give of that is when it comes to freedom of navigation in international waters. The PLA will operate within 12 nautical miles of other countries' islands, be it the United States off of Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, or Japan, or in the Indian Ocean, as is completely compatible and consistent with international law. But when it comes to the South China Sea, they raise concerns. And in my experience, when I've talked with Chinese scholars about these concerns and the principle of freedom of navigation, the Chinese officials, the Chinese scholars would often say, you know, we have no objection to freedom of navigation. We support that right entirely, but these issues are sensitive. China is a special case, so probably in this area is a place where we shouldn't be doing that. And I think you see that in various other areas of national power as well, where they're generally supportive of the established system, but rather trying to carve out exceptions for themselves. And I describe that as exceptionalist. The last point I'd make on this, and the point is made in the book more, that there's a statement from Chinese diplomats that I hear a lot. I'm sure Susan's heard a lot. Anyone who's spoken Chinese a lot is this concept of, they'll say a he butong. It's this idea, what they describe as harmony, not uniformity. And the way I describe that concept in the book is, to me, it conveys a sense that China is going to do what it believes it needs to do. And it's up to the rest of the world to adjust to that. And there's a great example of that when the Chinese ambassador gave an interview on Fareed Zakaria's show on CNN a few months ago, after the book was published, and I think it was a couple of weeks from being out in stores. And Fareed pressed him on a wide variety of different issues, on Uyghurs, on Hong Kong, on the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And the ambassador's response was very interesting and telling to me. He said, and I'm quoting here, the fundamental question for the United States is very simple. Is the United States ready or willing to live with another country with very different culture, very different political and economic system? Whether the United States is ready to live with it in peace and cooperate on so many and still growing global challenges. So to me, this conveys a sense that China's doing these things, and it's up to the rest of the world to decide whether or not it's going to be okay with that. And that to me conveys a broader exceptionalist approach to the established order.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of a quote I heard from another China analyst in an event a few years ago, talking about American and Chinese exceptionalism. And he said roughly, American exceptionalism is, we're so great, everyone should follow our example and be like us. And Chinese exceptionalism is much more, we're so great, no one could be like us, and therefore, you know, we're allowed to have a different set of rules. But I think you've nailed, and actually the ambassador's quote really nails the challenge here, is how do these two countries, which have so much to gain from cooperation, work together despite their different histories, cultures, and approaches to the international system? We are already getting some really excellent questions in. So I'm going to abandon my plan to just have the two of us talk about my ideas and go ahead and start asking some questions that are relevant to this part of our discussion. So we have a great question from Mark Tokola of KEI. He asks, does striking a stable balance of power with China require ceding to China a sphere of influence? And I think that this goes along with this question of whether or not like China can carve out a space in the rules-based order for itself that is different or exceptional. So what do you think? Does cooperation with China require ceding a sphere of influence, or is there a different approach?
Well, I don't think that it does. I think that spheres of influence, the way we tend to think about it is very much a 19th century concept of a geographic sphere of influence in which one country is dominant. To me, it doesn't make sense in a world with a globalized economy and the globalized communications technologies, infrastructure streams. To me, to get to that, I think would require a real step back in a lot of different areas. But what my book describes, though, is what I think is a more updated view of these sorts of dynamics. I call it the Indo-Pacific's emerging heterarchy. It's a heterarchy being a system of overlying hierarchies in which the United States and China compete across multiple measures of national power, be it trade communities or security mechanisms, technology standards, basically creating their own environments. And I describe it as sort of the emergence of, we could think of it as something of a functional sphere of influence in which China dominates one trade community and the United States dominates another trade community, with middle powers probably picking and choosing, depending on what they see as to be in their interests. So what I expect to happen is less a granting of a geographic sphere of influence, but rather competing functional spheres of influence across all elements of national power. And to me, that drives the argument from an American perspective that we need to compete with China across these different elements. We need a compelling alternative when it comes to infrastructure or trade communities, that it's not enough to just go to these countries and say, no, like you can't get Huawei in your infrastructure. You can't sign up to BRI, or you shouldn't sign up to BRI, but rather to say we have a better alternative for 5G, we have a better alternative for BRI. And that way, I think, is a more effective way of competing with China in these different functional spheres of influence.
Yeah, I think the concept of a heterarchy is one that I found super helpful, right? We are living in this complex world where there's a lot of follow-on effects to different policy choices. And if we see everything kind of through a competitive lens, and those follow-on effects become quite adversarial rather than really looking at what's best for each country in the region and their own national interests. So I did want to ask you, like, what does the region want from the US and from China? And are there any areas of overlap in terms of, behaviors, values, assistance that can be given by these major powers to the region?
Yeah, if you look at opinion polling, and in my admittedly much less scientific experience with foreign scholars and officials, and since I left the Obama administration, the sense that I get, one, is that the region is still looking for American leadership. There's a lot of concern about where the United States is going, a lot of uncertainty about the sustainability, reliability of American power, and a lot of concerns about the Trump administration's policies. Yet the vast majority of public opinions and most officials that I've spoken with across the region still want the United States to be there, to be engaged, and to lead. For example, if you look at Pew opinion polling, confidence in President Trump specifically is quite low in most countries around the region, with a couple exceptions. The Philippines, he's quite popular. But the views of the United States are almost entirely positive. And in many countries, most large majorities prefer to see American leadership. And even when compared to the Chinese, and even comparison of relative power, most people across the region expect that China will be more powerful than the United States in 10 years. but the vast majority, more than 5 times as many, I should say more than 4 times as many, expect the still want the United States to be the leading power and think that it'd be better for them if the United States was the leading power. So I think what they want from the United States is for us to engage, to understand what we're actually doing vis-a-vis the Chinese, and to make sure that our allies and partners have the ability to pursue their interests, to hedge. That when the United States tries to force these countries to make choices, it actually, in some ways, drives them away from us. Whereas to me, there's really no comparison in Australia's relationship between the United States and China, or even the Philippines relationships, because they're not allies to China. Their security is not dependent on China. They want to be able to have good relationships with both. I think we should probably want to have at least productive relationship with the Chinese. And so to me, it's about having the confidence to compete and making sure allies and partners have the ability to make those decisions, because I have the confidence in our system that the vast majority of the time we'll win in every competition that we have with the Chinese, because our system is just more attractive and better if we have something that we can offer to them.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to, I want to get back to the Philippines in a second, because I think this is a super interesting case study for tensions within U.S. alliance networks. But in the meantime, we've gotten a question in from Stephen Shan at University of Texas, Austin, that I think hits on something that we should discuss before we get into the elements of the strategy that you're laying out. And he asks, what is the desired end state of the U.S.-China relationship in pursuing this competition or in pursuing this strategy? And to further build on that, what does the U.S. think the ideal role for China in the region would be? Are we still trying to prevent the emergence of a regional hegemon? Have we kind of shifted our thinking on what China should do in the region given its growing power?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak to what the Trump administration wants. I can give you my sense of what they want, but in terms of what I'm describing, what I'm seeing on these things, to me, a desired end state with the Chinese in terms of our competition is to revitalize and sustain a liberal order for the 21st century, which I think is under pressure in large part from China, and that we work with our allies and partners, and our allies and partners contribute more to the health and success of that liberal order. In terms of specifically China, I think that we should try to expand the breadth of our ability to cooperate with them in areas of mutual interest. So things like climate change, counterproliferation, things like that. But we need to do it in a very careful way. There's been times when I think the United States has been a bit counterproductive in describing competition with China. For example, saying things like, we cannot solve climate change without the Chinese, because this sends a message to Beijing that climate change cooperation could be a leverage point. And pretty soon thereafter, you start to hear from Chinese scholars, Chinese officials, that, we'd love to work with you on climate change, but how could we do that if you're selling weapons to Taiwan or meeting with the Dalai Lama or whatever it may be? And to me, there's I think a built-in sense in the United States that there are friends and there are adversaries. Whereas I think our relationship with China is going to be much more complex than that. One of my pet peeves is when I would hear officials say that we need to find the right balance between competition and cooperation. And it bothers me as a pet peeve because it suggests that cooperation and competition are sort of mutually exclusive, and you can't have one go up without the other going down. I actually think that I expect in the future we're going to see both of them increasing at the same time. Where in areas of mutual interest like climate change, we may be able to cooperate with them, hopefully, but at the same time, we still need to compete with them in areas of our interest, be it on security issues, on human rights, on international institutions, whatever it may be. And we need to have the dexterity to be able to navigate those complexities. In terms of what a China that, an end state for China, going forward, I think there's a lot of different options. I'm broadly not in the business of telling other countries what they should be. But given my mind, I think there's both a normative and a strategic rationale for wanting to see China liberalize and democratize. But to me, that's not a very useful policy stance. To me, we work with the world that we have. We try to shape the choices and the calculations of countries that we deal with. And to me, the best way to do that when it comes to China is to strengthen ourselves, to be more effective in our competition, and to work more with our allies and our partners.
So let's talk a little bit about the building blocks of your strategy then. You've just laid out a few of them, work with allies and partners. Could you tell us in a little more detail how the book lays out this argument for US strategy in the Asian century?
Sure. So I wrote it a bit differently than most American strategy books. We're all trained when we write strategies to have the same sort of structure of ends, ways, and means. That the ends, this is what we want to accomplish, the means of how we're going to get there, and the ways of what the resources that we need to get there. I think I need to reverse those. But when I read Chinese strategy documents, though, they're very different. They just begin by describing the external international environment and the context in which China is making its approach, in which the strategy is evolving. And I try to do a bit of both. Their approaches. The downside of the Chinese strategies is that the objectives and the ways and means are often pretty obscure or unstated. So I tried to have a bit of both, where I describe the external context, but also get fairly practical in terms of what we're trying to do. So the broad argument is that the liberal order is something that's been in American interest for a long time, that it's fraying, that its foundations are fraying because of two trends, one being deepening questions and uncertainties about American power, and two, by the rise of China. And it tries to take a realistic understanding of where the Chinese are, where the United States is. And then the strategy that it recommends, one is to build American strength, to invest in our own capabilities, to double down on our ability to compete in Asia by investing in the roots of American strength and power. But also by engaging with and updating, revitalizing our alliances and partnerships in the region so that they're doing more to defend themselves, to contribute to a liberal order as a way to both compete with China, but also to sustain that order into the future as the geopolitics of the region change. And there's a lot of detail into it. It develops a framework about how this would work broadly with our allies and partners, but then it goes into each country, it does a country by country analysis of specifically what we could do with Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, India, Australia, the ASEAN countries, even Europe. It talks about what we could do with Europe when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's a mix of sort of a theoretical, strategic level analysis, but also trying to be somewhat policy relevant as well.
Right. I mean, it sounds like, just summarizing the beginning of your argument, that the US really needs to recommit to the international system and strengthen the international system. So my next question is, how do we get China to buy into this system? If the strategy is to kind of work through the international system to empower our allies and partners, is that by necessity exclusionary of China's participation and interest? Or how do we make the argument to them that it is continually in their best interest to recommit to the system as America conceives it, as the US tries to operationalize it?
Yeah, I think that we do need to have those discussions with the Chinese. And in areas where we agree that our interests overlap, that we can identify ways to compete, to cooperate in those areas. But to me, the key driver of American calculations shouldn't be where we can get the Chinese to change their mind. I think our ability to shape China's calculations has been mixed at best. At times they've been come around and supported US preferences in the international system. We could, non-proliferation is one example. There's many others as well. But in other areas, they simply don't. They don't agree. And I think continuing to engage them is important, but US strategy, to my mind, should be focused on the principles and the interests that drive our own policy. So if in a particular institution, we find ourselves in a competitive frame with the Chinese over a specific issue, to my mind, the way to go ahead is to double down, to invest American power, invest American diplomacy into these areas, and to collaborate with our allies and partners, so that even if the Chinese don't agree, I firmly believe that we can summon enough geopolitical strength by the United States with our allies and partners working together to counteract what the Chinese can do. Our allies and partners are an inherent advantage that the Chinese can't match. And that's true, I think, in the military realm, but also across all other avenues of national power. And a great example of this to me is the WHO and the WHA, in which the Trump administration grew frustrated, saying China has too much influence and stopped funding and withdrew. To me, that was the opposite of what the United States should do. Nobody asked the question, why is China so much influential than the United States in this organization? It might be because that the Trump administration did not appoint an ambassador to the organization that oversees the WHO for 2 years, until October of 2019. That we need to engage these organizations, these institutions, work with our allies and partners, and use that influence, use that power to push through our preferred alternatives. I would love to see Taiwan to have a voice in the WHA, but withdrawing is not going to get it. I think we need to actually invest in our own capabilities, have the confidence to compete, and I think we'll have much more success in terms of actually pushing through our policy initiatives within these institutions.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, what you're describing and some of the complexities of this issue have to do with the blending, I think, of domestic and foreign policy, right? Like that in our own domestic political context, there is a certain view of how you should consolidate and use power in the international system that changes with administrations. I want to talk a little bit and draw on your experience working as a government official to answer Mark Mannion's question. Mark is from CRS. And he is asking if you could provide some kind of lessons learned in formulating what is commonly now known as a whole of government strategy for focusing on the region or for one country. So like he's asking, what are the necessary conditions to be successful in speaking with a unified voice from the US government? Yeah,
it's always tricky. And it's sort of this platonic ideal that's, I think, never going to be achieved, but we could always draw ever closer. I think at the foundation, what's most important is a clear and consistent vision from the president. I was lucky working in the Obama administration in that we had that, and that President Obama was very clear and committed to a very specific strategy towards Asia, and our leadership was very clear in implementing that strategy. But even then, it was difficult. There's cultural differences between departments that make implementation of policies different. You can recall when the Obama administration announced the rebalance, and 6 months later, the rebalance was on every PowerPoint slide that the U.S. military developed, and slogans were being put out, and things were moving, and different parts of the government just are slower, a lot more nuanced in their approach to things. And so understanding those cultural differences are important, but to me, beyond the clear vision and commitment from top leadership is clear and specific practical goalposts to meet. I've never been in a room during an emergency or during a strategy session where people are talking about what to do and someone says, well, click, what does the QDR say? And in order to do that, we need to take these high-level objectives, these sort of conceptual ideas of what we want to accomplish, and translate them into, that means that by the end of FY 2023, we'll have ABC, and identify who's going to be responsible for that, and having a very specific strategy of how are we going there. And it's not fun to do those sorts of things. It's not the high power strategery of writing a book and talking about vision and order. But in order to get things done in government, there needs to be both the vision as well as the practical know-how of getting from A to B to C. And that's in the Pentagon, that's in the State Department, that's across all departments. And the last piece to it that I mentioned is making sure that all departments understand their role in the strategy, that once the president sets a vision of this is what we're going to accomplish, that every department knows that what they're expected to do as part of that, how it all sort of fits together. And that can always be a tricky part too. But yeah, I don't think there's a magic sauce. I think it just takes it takes vision, but also just some hard-nosed policy bureaucratic work.
So let's talk about some specific issues, because we've got a lot of questions popping up here about, strategies that the Trump administration is bringing to bear right now, things that have been talked about in the international relations community for a long time that have not been, operationalized. And let's start with the Quad, because we've gotten a lot of questions about that. I think after Deputy Secretary Began came out and said that, recently that the Quad should kind of serve almost a NATO type function of formalization and security in the Indo-Pacific, that it brought a lot of attention to this issue at this time. We've got a couple of questions about the Quad. I'm going to ask Doug Pauls, Doug from Carnegie Endowment in DC and formerly our representative in Taiwan. How would you characterize the role, potential, and limits of the Quad, in this case, US, India, Australia, and Japan?
Yeah, I talk about the Quad a great deal in my book. To me, the Quad has a lot of potential, but it will take us to reconceive of how we think about these sorts of relationships. To me, it's a natural grouping of like-minded states in which we have a lot of mutual interests, a lot of shared concerns, especially about China, but not just about China. But I think the way forward is not through explicit, formalized security and military arrangements like we have with NATO. On one hand, I don't know what was in Steve Began's mind. His phrasing was a little unclear. I can't imagine that the United States wants to establish a collective security arrangement with India and have ourselves embroiled in conflicts in Kashmir and Afghanistan and all that. So it's unclear to me what exactly he was proposing, but to me, the Quad would be most helpful if it could expand to all elements of national power. The book that I wrote actually talks about how the US needs to broaden its understanding of alliances, that it's not just military relationships, but rather as platforms of cooperation across all elements of national power. And to me, the Quad could be a great platform for cooperation on diplomatic initiatives, initiatives in international institutions, on international economic development and development assistance in Southeast Asia and Africa. There's already cooperation happening among some of them. Japan and India are doing some work together in Africa, I believe. But there's a lot that could be done in all these different elements. And security, I think, should be just part of the broader piece. Not in terms of a formalized security relationship, but in terms of enhancing our ability to operate together, enhancing our military relationships, sharing our ideas about concerns about China and other stability issues, and really building those relationships as part of a broader effort to me. But formalizing something along the lines of NATO, not only do I think it's unfeasible, in that I think both India and Australia would be quite concerned about it beyond our own concerns about what it would actually entail. But I actually think it complicates our ability to work with them going forward by even mentioning the idea. I believe the Deputy Secretary said that, bringing Australian cooperation into the Malabar exercise would be a step towards that formalization, which I think just makes it harder to get Australia involved in Malabar. That from that now, India has to decide if they invite Malabar, is that signaling to the world and is that signaling to themselves that they're interested in this sort of Asian NATO? To me, it's better to allow for ambiguity, allow for uncertainty, move ahead anyway, make progress in a practical way, and worry about the, who gets the secretariat and who designs the logo at a later time.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that the comments really change the context of all of the decision making as you just laid out. So that makes it more it complicates areas where where strategic ambiguity works in our favor. And I want to talk about a couple of those other areas in just a second, but let's continue on this theme of broadening and deepening alliance partnerships and broadening and deepening engagement in the Indo-Pacific. We've had a number of questions come up about the role of trade and institutions and whether or not the US is ready, willing, able to engage in major trading deals. You know, we have a question from Paul Pass, what's the status of the TransPacific Partnership? I think that could be a pretty short answer and that it's moving on without us. But we also had a question about whether or not, you know, the US would be willing to join institutions that China has created, including AIIB and others, in order to find that kind of common space for cooperation or to influence those regional institutions. So what do you think that we can do in terms of institutionalization in Asia, kind of outside our formal security alliance partnerships? And how should we use those allies to further our institutional goals?
Yeah, while it was still in negotiation, during the Obama administration, I came out in favor of TPP. I testified to that fact before Congress, not from an economic point of view, from a strategic point of view. I'm not an economist by any measure, and defer to the experts on the economic side of it. But for me, from a strategic point of view, the logic of TPP was quite clear. Politically, trade agreements are very difficult right now in the United States. Traditionally, it's been the Democratic Party that's been more skeptical about those sorts of arrangements, primarily because of their implications for labor, and whereas the Republican Party that was more pro-free trade. And what we've seen over the last few years, especially during the Trump administration, has been a real change on one side of the aisle there when it comes to free trade, at least parts of it. So I think it's going to be difficult moving forward, regardless of who wins in the next election. Not to say that it's impossible, but we're going to have to do a lot of work to make sure that the argument makes sense from both a strategic and an economic perspective. In terms of institutions, I think we need to think creatively that the changing strategic environment is raising new challenges for us, and we can't be just locked into the pre-existing institutions and ways of working that we've had before. So there's a lot of proposals that are out there. I talk about a few of them in the book about establishing mechanisms for data security, for technology cooperation, and using mechanisms across allies and partners in order to establish those so that we can develop these ecosystems based on liberal principles of privacy and security and freedom of speech. And to me, we need to make sure, in terms of specific institutions like AIIB versus the World Bank, to me, it's what's more important is less who's in charge of it, is what's the role of the institution and what are the principles that guide it. To my very admittedly limited understanding, I don't talk about AIIB in the book, is that AIIB has been doing better in terms of its principles and its commitments to transparency and whatnot, but still has work to do. If we think we can do the work that we need to do through existing institutions like the World Bank, I think there's no need, we can reform rather than create from new. But broadly speaking, I think the focus needs to be on our interests and our principles. And just because if AIB seems to support those interests and principles, the question of who established it is less salient than what it actually does. But broadly speaking, beyond that, I'd rather see the United States leading and working with allies and partners to make sure that these institutions that we engage represent our values and promote our interests. And I think that it's much easier to do that in institutions that we've already established and that we already have a leadership role in.
Yeah, you have just hit on something that I am so excited to talk to you about, and this is the tension at times between our interests and our principles. And I think this comes to play in the alliance network, right? Because not every ally looks exactly like us in terms of principles. You mentioned freedom of speech as a guiding principle, but of course we have alliances and security partnerships in countries that have very different views on freedom of speech and the utility of it, or how it should be regulated by the government. So let me take a step back from that very contentious point and just ask, you know, one of the arguments you make in the book is that we've had a hub and spoke alliance network, but circumstances are such that it would be helpful for us to have more of a network, for these allies to be working together with us and independently. I think that one of the challenges that the US has had is that the allies themselves have very different priorities, national interests, and threat perceptions, right? So sometimes it can be very difficult, you know, from the US point of view, it would be strategically enormously helpful if, for example, South Korea and Japan could develop a better relationship. But in reality, there are barriers to that cooperation due to, you know, domestic politics, history, and various other factors. So what are some of like the challenges in fostering cooperation among allies, and what are your thoughts on how to address these challenges?
It's a terrific question. In the book, I actually talk about how moving from beyond a hub and spoke to a more networked approach to our alliances and partnerships in Asia by building on these unilaterals and multilaterals that you described, Korea and Japan being, I think, the most consequential. And in order to, there's, I think, inherent challenges in a lot of these relationships, and there's some lingering animosities, distrust amongst a lot of these countries. And the United States is not going to be able to convince these countries to just forget about it, that these concerns are going to linger for a while. But we have been able to overcome them in the past. And I think if we look at that history, we can see what it takes to overcome them. And specifically when it comes to Japan and Korea, my sense is that the two factors that are necessary to overcome, well, I guess there's three factors to overcome those challenges. One is their domestic politics, and that we have limited ability to influence those, that having leaders on both sides that are willing to engage. But more than that, what we can engage, one is that a shared threat perception. I had somebody who worked for me at the Wilson Center, who worked with us at the Wilson Center, wrote an analysis of the rapprochement between Japan and Korea in the 1960s, and found that one of the driving factors of it was a Chinese nuclear test, which galvanized concern about communism in both countries and drove them to engage with one another. The other piece is American engagement, and the United States pressuring both sides to overcome their differences towards a common interest, towards a common challenge, and changing their political calculations that while raising this issue may help me domestically here, it would get me in bad with the United States, and that would hurt me more. And we haven't been very effective lately in either of those scores, but I think they are overcomable. But more broadly speaking, I think the hub and spoke as a core is going to remain. We're not going to create a collective security arrangement like we have in Europe, but we can strengthen the bonds, the multilaterals and minilaterals around mutual interests, shared principles, and they would have to be very much issue by issue. Which is, and the last point I make is why I emphasize the importance of order and sustaining and building a liberal order and revitalizing it. Because for a lot of these countries, there's very little interest in being what they would say is sort of a pawn in the US-China competition. But if we emphasize that we're doing this not to compete with China, but rather as a way to strengthen a liberal order and to revitalize that liberal order, it's much more palatable, not only for liberal states, but also for smaller illiberal states like Vietnam, which isn't a big fan of liberalism at home, but does look for an international environment in which major powers are somewhat constrained by institutions, laws, and norms, because it's to their advantage. So I think it takes some dexterity from the American perspective, a bit of flexibility, but I think there's a lot that we can do in that specific area if we keep our eyes on what we're actually trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think invest the effort in those ideas. So we've had a lot of questions about specific problem areas, and I want to go through 3 in kind of succession here. They're all related to, I think, you know, to China's national goals of rejuvenation, of national territorial integrity. So if you could just quickly, I think we'll start with my favorite topic, which is Taiwan. We've had some questions about, you know, where do you see the cross-strait situation going, and what are the elements of the strategy that you have that would be particularly helpful to addressing cross-strait tensions? So just table that for 1 second. Then let's talk about North Korea and nuclear proliferation in the region. Again, same question, what elements of your strategy would be helpful in addressing nuclear non-proliferation, and particularly North Korea's, you know, pattern of kind of aggressive behavior. And then third, and probably the one we could spend a whole hour and a half talking on and have before, is the South China Sea. How do we kind of come up with a strategy? I think what people are asking in general is that it seems that China's behavior is becoming more aggressive in certain areas. Certainly, like with regard to Taiwan, overflights, military drills, rhetoric, poaching diplomatic allies. The last 4 years have been difficult. Ditto the South China Sea, establishing man-made islands, you know, military and paramilitary patrols, again, like a sense of aggressive behavior. And then I think on North Korea, we just have this very different national interest prioritization, really. I think, you know, the US and China both want North Korea to give up its nuclear program, but where we place that on the priority list of how to deal with North Korea can be very different at different times. So I guess in broad terms, I'm wondering what specifically about your strategy would be helpful in these situations, but also, like, are there ways to impose costs on aggressive behavior? Because it seems as though, you know, that has been a frustration, a deep frustration in the region, is the inability to impose costs on aggressive behavior. And I know that there's a US role in helping the region kind of figure out how to appropriately impose costs, and be interested to hear your views. So let's start with Taiwan.
Yeah, you really hit the greatest hits there. When it comes to Taiwan, I think it's clear that the cross-strait situation has grown more tense in the last few years. I'd say China has been driving that tension. They are concerned about President Tsai, and they see her as committed to a pro-independence agenda. The fact that she's extremely careful and pragmatic and hasn't been pushing a radical agenda at all doesn't seem to dissuade them from that view. And you know, the United States, I think, has played a very interesting role, and I think it's interesting to see how U.S. approach to Taiwan has evolved. While the headlines are still consistent in terms of the one China policy, the United States has grown far louder in its engagement with Taiwan. I tend to think of it as sort of an example of a policy where it hasn't changed substantially. They've just turned up the volume and been much more in their face about our engagements with Taiwan. And I'm not sure how much that actually helps. I tend to, when it comes to Taiwan, what I suggest in terms of a Taiwan policy, what's in the book, is really in four areas, or I should say, really 3 areas. First is economic diversification, that Taiwan can be less reliant on, less vulnerable to Chinese coercion if they diversify their economic engagement. And the first step to that has to be deepening US-Taiwan engagement. So I think we're finally making progress in that area. I was glad to see that Taiwan is amending their laws, or at least has proposed to amend their laws, and that I saw that Assistant Secretary Stilwell announced an economic dialogue with Taiwan, which I hope will get us towards the path of getting towards a broader agreement that we could then build off of to further diversify Taiwan's economy. In international space being the second area that the United States could do a lot to represent Taiwan's interest in international institutions, to advocate for Taiwan's participation in appropriate organizations and urge our allies and partners to do the same. I mentioned the WHO and WHA. I think after the COVID crisis, there's no better policy to advocate in terms of inclusion than Taiwan's engagement in the WHA. I think they've definitely shown that they have a lot to offer there. In terms of the third area would be to strengthen cross-strait deterrence, to revitalize our defense relationship, to be much more oriented towards asymmetric capabilities that could help Taiwan defend itself in a survivable, effective, and sustainable way, but also that values substance over symbolism. So much of the debate when it comes to US-Taiwan defense ties is on ultimately symbolic gestures of including Taiwan in an exercise or having a ship visit in one place or another that I fear ultimately just hurts Taiwan in the end. Whereas I think we could actually help Taiwan if we focus on more substantive pieces that actually enhance Taiwan's ability to defend itself and to have a voice in the international community.
Yeah, I think you've hit on an important point here as well, which is that, and this is something we talk about all the time at the National Committee, which is that when the US strengthens relationships with partners in ways that China is unhappy about, the costs are often then imposed on those allies and partners because China is not able to impose a lot of cost on the United States. So I think it's always, especially when it comes to Taiwan, but I think in all of our partnerships, we have to ask ourselves not just what we can do, but what we should do and what the follow-on effects are. But maybe from that point, we can pivot to North Korea, another place where, the US has been in a constant state of conflict, really, over the last 70 years since the end of the Korean War. What do you think the US should do with regard to solving the North Korean nuclear issue and ultimately bringing about peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, if you look at our history of engagement on North Korea, there's been some great books on these that has come out lately. The US strategy towards North Korea has really run the gamut of different approaches and tried a lot of different combinations of strategies. And so far, nothing's worked. But I think it would be a mistake to give up and to just declare that this isn't going to happen. That I think that we could be making progress, and it's possible to make far more progress than has happened over the last few years. Despite the theatrics of President Trump's engagements with Kim Jong-un, North Korea still remains fully capable of building more nuclear weapons, building more missiles, and as time goes on, the security situation actually just gets worse. So to me, a key step would be to engage North Korea diplomatically, but in a much more substantive, less theatrical way, focused on freezing and then drawing down their most threatening capabilities. And the specifics of the deal have been known for decades. The key, though, is I think to make step-by-step progress, remain committed to our principles, but most importantly, to remain committed to our allies and to our interests. That whatever engagements we're maybe undertaking with North Korea, we need to sustain, modernize, and upgrade our engagements with South Korea, and make sure that alliance remains strong and is able and capable in the face of North Korea and other regional challenges. But there's no real, there's no magic bullet that I've found, at least so far, when it comes to North Korea. But in your earlier formulation of the question, you also talked about nuclear proliferation. That to me is a key piece and something that we can do a lot in terms of containing the threat that North Korea poses, not just in terms of nuclear proliferation, but in cyberspace as well and other forms of illicit activity. And that's an area not only where our alliances could be helpful, but also engagements with China as well. And to me, talking with China about North Korea would be a very important piece to it. The last piece I mentioned on North Korea is that we've been engaging with a lot of the same people for a long time in North Korea. And one area that we've never had before, at least in modern times, that I think might be fruitful, at least when it comes to proliferation, would be military-to-military engagements. And having the ability to actually talk to the North Korean military might be a way to talk to people who, frankly, as my sense is, have more say in nuclear policy than some diplomats do. And at the very least, give us some more insight about what's happening in North Korea. It might not be a terribly feasible plan considering where everything is, but I do think it's something that we should at least consider, at least when it comes to the Chinese.
Sure, and of course we certainly have like strategic talks with other adversaries in history, including ones with which we did not have diplomatic relations. So I think there's some precedent there. It's just, again, the North Koreans get a vote on this, and are they willing to come to that type of table, and under what conditions are they willing to come to that type of table, I think remains the open question. You know, I want to get to the South China Sea in just a minute, but your answer about proliferation reminded me that proliferation is not just a nuclear issue, but we are also kind of in a situation with China in which this, the Trump administration is attempting to bring back intermediate range ballistic missiles to the region. And I think that that's really complicated our relationships with allies and partners who maybe understand the high level strategic value in US-China relations of doing that, but don't necessarily want to base those missiles on and around their shores. Could you talk a little bit about how you see this situation developing in terms of the U.S. pullout of the international treaty governing intermediate range missiles, and kind of what we're asking our allies and partners to do today that might have reverberation effects down the line?
Sure, that's a great question. The INF Treaty was established for a very specific context for US-Soviet competition in Europe. And in that, it made tremendous sense. But I think as the geopolitical environment evolves, it makes sense to take a fresh look at our treaties and obligations. I have serious concerns and problems with how the Trump administration withdrew from the INF Treaty. I think it could have been done much more effectively. But considering where we are now, it does open options. And my sense is that without these restrictions, the US military does have more options to complicate Chinese military planning if we were able to deploy some of these weapons, some of these capabilities into Asia. Personally, I'm okay with the idea of developing capabilities, even though we don't have a specific place to put them yet. We've done that with other systems before and we worked it out. And that's, to me, achievable. And there's ways to sort of gradually introduce these sorts of systems. But I think we need to make a very clear distinction. And this is where this is personally where I draw the line on these things. Making a clear distinction between intermediate range anti-ship cruise missiles that are ground-based and intermediate range ballistic missiles that are ground-based. To me, anti-ship cruise missiles make a lot of sense in terms of diversifying American defense capabilities, enhancing our ability to defend ourselves and our allies in a maritime environment, without the strategic implications of the intermediate range ballistic missiles, which I think are very problematic and we haven't really thought through. So if I had a magic wand on this, I would try to carve up these things separately and find a way where we can sort of protect the cruise missile capabilities that are under consideration, under development. Whereas I think ballistic missiles may be an area where we can still be some restrained, because I think the military benefits are fairly negligible. The challenge, though, that we have, and what I want to put back on, there's some rhetoric that this is the United States introducing a new capability into the region. It's not. China has made tremendous investments in these capabilities. They're not subject to the INF Treaty, so they're completely free to do so. But I've seen figures that something like 80% of Chinese ground-based missiles would violate the INF Treaty if they were part of that system. To me, the answer is not to try to get the Chinese to sign on to some sort of INF agreement. I don't think that's realistic. But I think we do need to be able to ensure that we're able to, one, defend ourselves and our allies, but two, manage the effects of these systems being out there. So we do need to have discussions with the Chinese about strategic stability, making progress towards some sort of arms control agreement, maybe not in this area, but in some area that manages the risk of escalation.
Excellent. So let's talk, I mean, this is not completely divorced from talking about the situation in the South China Sea, where you have, China's, I would say, very assertive, if not aggressive behavior, and perhaps attempts to crowd out the space for other actors in that area and to further their territorial goals. So what do you think the U.S. strategy should be in the South China Sea? Obviously, we want to defend the principle of freedom of navigation. It's a principle that I think, like many principles established in the international order that you go through in the book, benefits everyone and can be kind of equally applied. But how do we kind of reconcile the necessity of defending that principle with the reality on the ground, which is that there are entities that cannot have total freedom of navigation because of Chinese military and mostly paramilitary behavior?
Yeah, it's a very tricky challenge. And it's going to take, I think, a lot of different initiatives to address this. You'd mentioned earlier imposing costs on aggressive behavior, and I think that's part of that. In terms of, responding to these sorts of aggressions by enhancing our partnerships with these countries, by deploying more forces, by empowering them to defend themselves. My book talks a lot about how we could help these smaller countries in Southeast Asia to monitor their maritime areas, to share information, to defend their shorelines and their territorial seas. That there's a lot that we could do there. Which the Chinese could see as a way as a cost to their assertiveness. There's a lot that we could do in terms of enhancing our own capabilities in the region, not solely in the military sphere, but I'd actually say predominantly beyond the military sphere, in terms of doing more to build our relationships in Southeast Asia with development assistance, which I think would help a lot. We have not had an ambassador to ASEAN since the end of the Obama administration, so that would help, at least as a signal, if nothing else, to work with ASEAN and work with those countries as partners more. But I think beyond that, thinking broadly about the South China Sea, one of the challenges that we face is that China crosses bureaucratic lines in its approach, that there's military, paramilitary, civilians out there. And I think in order to be effective in our strategy, we need to go across bureaucratic lines as well, that there needs to be State Department elements to response. There needs to be Coast Guard involved, training our partners and allies to defend their shorelines more, helping them patrol waters. There needs to be Treasury Department's engagement of potentially sanctioning companies and individuals that are involved in illegal activities in the South China Sea or aggressive activities in the South China Sea. But beyond that, the specific policy things that we can do, I think there's the need for the United States to understand that a degree of turbulence in the relationship, a degree of risk in the relationship, in the dynamic in the South China Sea, is not only can be accepted here and there, but rather it's a necessary part of the dynamic with China. That the goal of our engagements with China in the South China Sea cannot be a smooth and steady relationship, but rather we need to make sure that we're comfortable with discomfort, that we will accept a degree of risk and a degree that we may have crises in the South China Sea. In order to show that we're going to push back and to demonstrate that resolve. It's not an easy thing to say, It requires us understanding the true value of the South China Sea and why this is important to us, why it's in America's interest to push back in these ways. But beyond that, to me, there's a more fundamental attitude from the United States. There's a lot of talk about deterrence and deterrence of gray zones, gray zone pressure and things like that, which I think we need to explore. But one of the approaches of the Obama administration to these pieces was to say that the United States would fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. Freedom of navigation operations, I think, were a manifestation of that. And to me, that's a form of deterrence. It's sending a message to the Chinese and to the rest of the region that you guys have built these islands, you're putting military things on them. We don't approve of that. We think it's going to cost you. It's helping us build these relationships in ways that we couldn't otherwise. But it's also not going to be effective in changing who we are, changing our strategies, changing where we operate. That it's going to have zero practical effect on what we do. And that to me is a different form of deterrence. It's deterrence by denial, that you're not going to achieve your goal. Their goal is to intimidate and to coerce. And it shows them that we're not going to be intimidated and we're not going to be coerced, and we're going to help our allies and partners to make sure they're not intimidated and they're not coerced. And that to me is probably the most effective way to handle these sorts of challenges.
Yeah, and it does seem like this is another area of consistency between the Obama and the Trump administration in terms of mounting these freedom of navigation operations. But perhaps like with Taiwan, the volume is being turned up a little bit now on the public messaging about them in order to, further make the point that we are not, that the United States itself is not going to change its behavior as a result of what we perceive as China's illegal actions in the South China Sea. But even further, I'm really, I think that you made a really important and salient point about balance of power, which is that we kind of think of balance of power as achieving peace and stability, but it's not necessarily, it's never static, actually. It's always changing and dynamic, and it's not necessarily peaceful. So coming to a place where we're more comfortable with discomfort, more comfortable with friction, I think not just with China, but with other rising powers in this multipolar world is going to be an important part of America's political reckoning on how we get our domestic policy in line with our foreign policy. You looked like you had a point to add, so let's go to that, and then I'm going to ask you one more question before I kick it back over to Susan Thornton to make a couple of final points, and Susan Elliott to close us out. So go ahead.
Thanks. You mentioned the freedom of navigation operations, and to me they're a necessary but not nearly adequate aspect of a strategy. To me, they should be regular and normal, and to do that, and for them to be regular and normal, you need to do them regularly and normally. Making big press statements about them, making big shows about them. I saw there was a piece on Reuters today about them, I think is really only serves the function of poking it in China's eye. I think you treat them like any other. We do freedom of navigation operations all over the world. And I think you're public about it. You don't trumpet it. You just say, this is what we do. It's a statement of our principles, and we're just going to keep doing what we do. And we're not going to be intimidated or threatened, I think is an important piece to it. But I do think that your point about balance of power is important. I was field testing some of the arguments of this book about a year and a half ago at various conferences, and I was able to present one of my arguments to some Russian scholars. And I made the point with one of them that in Asia, order flows from power. The balance of power in the region describes, defines, and sets the regional order. And he thought about that for a second, and he shook his head and he said, it's not power, it's pressure that determines order. It's the application of power. And that got me thinking about how our engagements with the Chinese are. And I wrote a piece with some friends in War on the Rocks a month or two ago on Chinese aggressiveness post-pandemic. And we used a quote from Lenin that I thought was helpful, and it helps sort of frame this mindset of the need for or the expectation of some turbulence. And what Lenin wrote is to probe with the bayonet. If you meet steel, stop. If you meet mush, then push. It's the idea that I think, at least in some quarters in the CCP, they expect friction and resistance, and they'll continue to push until they meet it. And it's not to say that we got to be aggressive or militarized or anything, but rather to show resolve, to show dedication to our principles and our interests, and to not be intimidated.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. There's an interesting quote and an interesting way of looking at the pressure situation in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that there is another piece of that puzzle, which is that every time you impose pressure, leverage, we call this leverage in international relations usually, to reach your goals, there's kind of an equal and opposite reaction. So maybe just like, you know, gravity is kind of a law of international relations, so is this equal and opposite reaction. It doesn't always come out exactly as we think it will, or at the exact time of the pressure, but it builds. And therefore, you know, it is kind of impossible in my mind to look at this, you know, US-China competition as a snapshot at any given moment in time. But it's actually, you know, a series of pressures that are building in different ways in different countries, and the effects of which can, you know, come back negatively on the US if we decide to use our power coercively as well. I want to ask you, and I think your answer or your explanation here led us to what I think is going to be my final question. It comes from the Q&A section in our chat. And it has to do with how the pandemic has changed things. I have to say this may be the first event that we've held since March that we didn't start with how the pandemic has changed things. I think for what it's worth, perhaps that's achieving some kind of new normal. But you started, and I think I heard you finished this book before the pandemic. How has the US, Chinese, other countries, you know, response to the pandemic, the fact that it's laid bare very real limits to international cooperation, how has that affected your thinking on strategy?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I got the first reviews for the internal reviewers from the publisher before the book came out, one of the comments was, you know, they really like the book, but since it's policy relevant, that it'll at some point get overtaken by events. And I thought about it, and I read through it, and I thought, you know, these things don't change very much. It's not going to get, you know, there's not going to be some huge change to the geopolitics of Asia. So when the outbreak came, when the pandemic started after the manuscript got sent to the publisher, I thought, well, there you go. But what's interesting is I sent the book out to some mentors, the manuscript to some mentors to write blurbs for the book. And one of them came back, it was from Richard Armitage. And he wrote that it's I forget the exact words, it's on the back of the book, I should look at it, but it's basically saying it's a blueprint for US strategy in a post-coronavirus world. And that really surprised me because I hadn't really thought about it that way. But but in retrospect, I think it works well in that it talks about the importance of order, institutions, and how the United States can adjust to change. And to me, when I look at this historically, I'm giving a speech about the implications of post-coronavirus geopolitics in a couple of weeks, so I've been working on this issue. Historically, my sense is that these sorts of events, these major cataclysms, they change international order, but in a somewhat regular way, in that they tend to accelerate pre-existing dynamics. In that World War I and World War II accelerated the demise of European empires and the rise of the United States. As an example, the Opium War accelerated the demise of the Qing dynasty, the rise of Japan. My sense is that the coronavirus is likely going to accelerate both the intensity of US-China competition, but also deepening concerns about American power. You may recall those are the two forces I identified as most threatening to the long-term survival of the liberal regional order. And that to me, both of those trends have been accelerated by the coronavirus. In that US-China competition was intensified because of China's role in the outbreak, and their resulting aggressiveness across the board as well. And I think we've seen that coming about already. And deepening questions about American power, that the United States has not stood up to lead. In fact, we've been the spoiler in a lot of these institutions. You may recall that the G7 meeting was called by France, not the United States, to talk about coronavirus. The G20 meeting was not called by the United States, it was called by Saudi Arabia. You may recall that the United States was the spoiler in that because we refused to sign a joint statement because they wouldn't call it the Wuhan virus. Beyond that, just the basic competence of the US government's response to the coronavirus, I think, has raised questions among allies and partners and adversaries alike about the reliability of American power, that if we can't protect our own people effectively, what does that mean about our ability to come to the aid of our allies and partners, and let alone to assert our own interests? I'm not saying I agree with those questions. I actually think that's a wrong take. I think that the United States is still highly capable. But I think it shows to me that the framework that the book describes and the strategic environment that the book describes is even more clear and relevant now than it was when I sent the manuscript in.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thanks so much for all of the great questions that our audience members ask. I take it as my own failing that I was not able to get to all of the questions. So please forgive me about that. And with that, I'd like to turn things back over to Susan Thornton, who has a couple of things that she'd like to say before we close out.
Great, thanks Rory, and thanks Abe for such a fantastic and deep conversation about these issues. You know, Abe, I note that, and I just want to hawk the book one more time again before we close out. So again, the title is Empowering Allies, a Strategy for a New Era in the Indo-Pacific. And I hope that everyone will run out and get a copy and go through the details that you have sort of touched on here in the discussion. But I note that this new era in the Asia-Pacific has actually, I think it's been seen to be coming by US officials for actually quite a long time. And I guess the thought that I want to close up for, I was so glad to hear you say that we need in US policy toward this region to focus on specific goalposts and kind of do the hard work of, you know, making progress one step at a time. Because, you know, we've been trying to rebalance to Asia now for at least the entire time that I've been working on China policy. So 20 years, I would say, not successfully, frankly speaking. And, you know, a lot of now the rebalance and the new Indo-Pacific strategy, which I think to some extent tracks with what you suggest in the book. You further develop it, and yours is a much more masterful presentation than I think any public presentation from the US government has been to date. But this idea of getting beyond the hub and spoke, networking allies together is something that's, you know, we've known we need to do now for a long time. And I guess the frustration I have is why does it not happen? And why is it such a militarized strategy? And of course, you know, I worked with you, you were at the Defense Department, but I come out of the State Department, and I do think that our strategy in doing this needs to be a lot more nuanced and a lot more reliant on, as you say, making these alliances platforms for all kinds of interaction, not just the military component. And we need to resource this strategy. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion in Washington about more resources for Indo-PACOM, plus ups in the budget, but we don't have assistance funding. We don't have money for the BUILD Act. We don't have money for Blue Dot Network. We don't have money. We aren't sending diplomats to meetings at ASEAN. We aren't showing up in leadership in the region in diplomacy. So I think it's just extremely frustrating that we sort of seem to know that we need to adjust to this new era, and we also know what we need to do, but we can't manage to execute against that. And I hope that your book will be a sort of a cudgel in Washington for convincing people, again, that we need to sort of look at this resourcing problem, this execution problem. How are we balancing against the military component, which is not necessarily the priority component that Asians want to see US leadership coming to them in, but also they want to see diplomatic leadership and economic leadership from us. And those are the things, frankly, that they're a bit more comfortable with, generally speaking, especially in a competition with China. So I think, you know, we really need to review our entire toolbox here in carrying out this kind of approach to the region if we want to remain relevant and if we want to counterbalance the sort of changing shift in power that's happening there and be effective. So I again want to just thank you so much for giving us your views, and I want to turn it over to the president of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, Susan Elliott, to close out the session, and thank all of our viewers again, and to Rory Daniels for being such an excellent moderator. But Susan, over to you.
Well, thank you, Susan. And Abe, I want to thank you for a very, very interesting and stimulating conversation, which really points out, I hope not only to me, but to all our participants, the complexity of not only U.S.-China relations, but, you know, relationships in Asia and around the world. So you've written a fantastic book, and I agree with Susan. I think that your book can serve as a framework and maybe a little nudge or a big nudge to Washington to try to look at, you know, what U.S. policy toward China and this area of the world should be. So thanks again, and also thanks for your continuing support and relationship with the National Committee. We're very pleased that you agreed to speak today, and also want to thank not only our participants for great questions, but Rory for being a great moderator. And so thanks very much, and we look forward to more engagement with you in the future. So thanks.
Well, thank you so much, both Susans and to Rory. Thank you so much for having me. It's great conversation. Completely agree with what Susan said. She and I have debated these issues for a long time. I could hear her voice in my head as I was making these arguments, and I'm just thrilled that you have her at the National Committee. I'm thrilled that I could participate, and thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. Thanks, and thanks to all our participants. Bye-bye.